Okay. So welcome everyone. What is today? February 21st. We have this webinar starting today, postponed from a week ago, because our guest, who is joining us all the way from Haifa, Israel, she had a little illness last week. So thank you for your patience and waiting for Aviva to be able to join us and for tuning in today. I'm going to say a few kind of introductory remarks and turn it over to Aviva. Dr. Aviva Berkovich-Ohana is an associate professor at the University of Haifa Faculty of Education and the Edmund J. Safra Brain Research Center. Her training includes a PhD in neurobiology at the Gonda Multidisciplinary Brain Research Center, Bar Ilan University, Israel, and a postdoctorate at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, as well as at the Sapienza University of Rome, Italy. Her primary research interests include the effects of contemplative mental training on consciousness, cognition, and self-reference. And a kind of personal note about this is I first met Aviva about 14 years ago at the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute, at which time she was not yet published in this domain. But we had a number of discussions over the course of a couple summers meeting there, where she outlined her aspirations to apply the discipline and distinctions of the field of neuroscience called neurophenomenology, coined by a wonderful predecessor of ours named Francisco Varela, who was really one of the foremost neuroscientists in bringing the worlds of Buddhism and meditative practice into communication with neuroscience, to apply this this framework of thought and study, which he coined as neurophenomenology, to not just meditation in general, but meditation specifically as relates to this really essential aspect that brings many people to want to dedicate their life towards a meditative path, the experience of the transformation of self-experience. And she's done an amazing series of studies in that direction. This was a long-standing primary interest of my own. So, I've been a cheerleader from afar for her work for many years, and I'm really just very, very grateful for the opportunity to really host you, Aviva, with our community here today, and hopefully, start some communications about potential collaborations going forward. And also, really, I want to take a moment to acknowledge, the reality, which you know much better than we, of what's happening in Israel, and that you're even taking the time, to share with us in the midst of such a catastrophic, sad time in the region where you live and have grown up. And I'll just leave it at that, and really just thank you for being here, and handing the stage over to you. And for all the attendees, as I mentioned earlier, some of you may not have been there, put any questions you have as Aviva goes. She's quite happy to answer questions as she presents, in addition to the half hour or so we have at the end for some questions and answers. So feel free to put in the chat box or the Q&A box any questions that you have, and we can address them. And the only other thing I'll mention at the outset is just, we do have another speaker next week, Tony King, who will be joining us from his new university, Ohio State University, where he's doing a lot of fMRI work with mindfulness for depression and PTSD. And he'll be joining us in person for a presentation at 4 p.m. this coming Monday at the Brain and Creativity Institute, Camilleri Hall. which will also be simulcast via Zoom. So you can join either in person or via Zoom for that. And for faculty, there'll be an opportunity for a reception to join in person after his talk next Monday. So without further ado, Aviva Berkovich-Ohana, thank you.
Thank you very much for this welcoming presentation and sensitive presentation. Can I share my screen?
I think I've made you a co-host, so it should go smoothly, yeah.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Wait a minute, I can't put it on the presentation mode, so maybe let me stop sharing and try to do that from here. Yeah, and then, no. I don't know. Wait a minute. Oh, yeah, I did it.
Perfect.
Okay. So welcome, everybody. And please feel free to ask questions. I might have taken for granted that you know some terms which you don't. So there is no ridiculous question. Any question is in place and I'm happy to answer. The title of my talk is Meditation and Self-Dissolution, using a neurophenomenological approach. And just to give you a very fast overview, I thought of starting with neurophenomenology very briefly, the what, why, and how. And now that I've heard that there is not much background, I'm a little sorry I didn't do more of that, but we'll see how it goes. And then I wanted to go into employing neurophenomenology to study self-boundary dissolution, which sounds like a pretty nuanced term. What is self-boundary and how does it dissolve? But I'll start with a little intro into the self. How do we study the self? The phenomenology and the neuroscience of the self. And that would just lay the ground to tell you about an evolving neurophenomenological dialogue that is happening in my lab in the last maybe 15 years. And of all the studies, I picked 3 studies that I think tell a nice story. The first one is was like a proof of concept, and then we zoomed in, and then we had a very large scale project. And from there, I'll can kind of summarize, and if we have the time, I can tell you about some future projects. So let me start to tell you about neurophenomenology. This is the late Francisco Varela. He died in 2001. And he coined, I think, the term neurophenomenology. And the way he approached it, he saw this as a remedy for the hard problem of consciousness in a pragmatic way. And basically, it combines neuroscience with phenomenology, which is the study of experience, but he meant in particular a continental philosophy. Husserl and Merleau-Ponty are the figures. And to use this combination of neuroscience and phenomenology, for example, by deep interviews, to study experience, mind, and consciousness. And just to stay a little bit on the first point, I don't know if everybody knows what exactly is the hard problem of consciousness and why could that be a remedy. So the hard problem of consciousness is the question of why at all any physical state has a subjective experience to it. So for example, if I look at a tomato, why do I see the redness of a tomato? And this is a very famous quote by Thomas Huxley saying, how is it that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as the result of irritating nervous tissue, is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubs his lamp in a story. So the materialistic view of there is the cortex and we have neurons, and neurons, they fire, and because of that, consciousness emerges. It's an emergent property of a lot of neurons firing together. This is one possibility, but some would think this is kind of a ridiculous possibility, and it doesn't really explain consciousness at all, the experience of consciousness. And so David Chalmers, the philosopher, Australian philosopher, coined this problem as the hard problem of consciousness in 95. And in 96, soon after that, Varela came up with neurophenomenology being a remedy to the hard problem of consciousness. What kind of remedy? A pragmatic remedy. So it doesn't solve the problem, it just makes it irrelevant, because if we combine neuroscience with the study of experience, and we kind of go back and forth in a very tight manner, we get to learn about, it's like the two sides of the same coin, and we get to advance with our understanding of consciousness. Now, the way he conceptualized it was that we should have three things. We should have the first-person data, the third-person data, and the second person. So let me tell you about these three components that are necessary for the neurophenomenological project. So first of all, we need the first-person data, the experience itself, the lived experience as can be extracted by deep microphenomenological interviews. Not necessarily micro, I'm saying microphenomenology because Claire Petit-Menjean is a philosopher who did her PhD with Varela, and she continued this line of work, and she developed the microphenomenology in a way that now is being taught, and how to analyze it, and the whole discipline was really pushed forward with her work. So we need, first of all, phenomenological mapping of the experience. Why is that? Because we want to be able to extract phenomenal invariants, in other words, categories. So if we interview, I don't know, a bunch of people, 20 people, let's say that we can somehow, I don't know, maybe we are interested, like a project in my lab now is interested in death experiences under ayahuasca. So let's say that some of them have experiences of actually feeling as if physically they are dying. Others experience something that is more mental, like a mental image of themselves is kind of dying, like they don't know their identity, but it's not as physical. And others might not have really feel that at all. So at least three major groups can be, or phenomenal invariants could be created out of this bunch of people. And why do we need that? Look at the second row. We want to use the first person data to employ it in order to gain access to the physiological processes, which is the third person, which is usually anything that we can measure. It can be any neuroscientific tool like we do. It could be fMRI, EEG, whatever. If we don't employ phenomenology, what usually people do is that they lump together all the participants and look at their brain. And then all the experiential or phenomenological differences between them are kind of excluded or being regarded as noisy data. For example, just to say that when I did my postdoc at the Weizmann Institute, in the lab next door, somebody was studying negative emotions. And the way they studied it, they put the participants in the fMRI and they showed them negative pictures from an inventory. They never even asked the participants if they felt a negative emotion while looking at that, but this is how they studied negative emotions. And I think it's not very rare, or at least it wasn't. Maybe now it is already. Anyways, between the first person and the third person data, so the neural processes and the phenomenology, there should be reciprocal constraints. And that is a question. What does it mean? How does one type of data constrain the other one? So I will propose later on some ways of thinking about it. The second person is the formal dynamical modeling. So creating formal models, actually mathematical models, analytic tools that come from dynamic system theory, that are grounded in the enactive approach, embodied approach to cognition. So the way this took really decades. And I think the one who is really pushing forth towards this is Antoine Lutz, who did his PhD also with Varela. And he's been working on that in the framework of predictive processing. I don't know if you know what it is, but maybe we can leave this to the questions afterwards. And yeah, just to say that it's taking decades, but it seems like this neurophenomenological project is coming to fruition. So in 2017, I published a little commentary on a paper by Claire saying that while in theory, it's pretty straightforward, you go from A to B, you collect third person, first person, then you do something to look at them together. In practice, it's very complicated. And the fact is that there is much more theoretical accounts saying how good it is or relevant it is to do neurophenomenology, and we should employ that. This is much more theoretical accounts like that instead of papers actually doing the empiric work. And why is that? I think that the challenges are very big. First of all, there's a trade-off between phenomenological thickness and what I call naturalization. What is the naturalization? Look, think of it like that. Interviewing brings me words, a lot of words. Third-person data is a lot of numbers. If it's EEG or fMRI, it doesn't matter. What I end up with a lot of numbers, and I have to find a way to look into the connection between the words and the numbers. So anything I want to do with the words to be able to at least correlate them or compare them to the numbers means naturalization. I need to do something with it. Now, if I have a very thick phenomenology and I have a full depth of the lived experience, I would have a very high resolution phenomenology that it would be very hard for me to naturalize it and to come up with a reduction to numbers. On the other hand, if I have a very thin phenomenology, let's think of it as thin as asking those people in the fMRI that are being shown the negative photos that are supposed to evoke negative emotions, asking them from 1 to 10 how negative was the emotion evoked in you. That would be a very thin phenomenology, but it would be first reporting in a way that is very easy to naturalize because they would actually give me a number. That would not even be considered as phenomenology, but some researchers would even go, do this little step. Anyway, this is one problem, that there is a tension. If I want to do study seriously the lived experience, I end up with, let's say, 1 hour interview about 1 minute meditation. That's a lot. So how am I gonna work with that and the third person data? Also, there's a difference in the resolution. Here I have 1 minute that I can talk later on about it for 1 hour, really diving into the experience and asking what was my sense of agency and ownership and perspective and sense of time and space and affect and attention, could really, really go into depth for a 1 minute meditation. But on the other hand, I have for that 1 minute meditation, let's say I sampled with 1000 hertz. I have a lot of data point, but I don't know which of the experiences I was being told in the 1 hour of the interview is related to which of the milliseconds in my, let's say, EEG. So it's hard to put them together. I cannot interview while I'm recording, so it's always in hindsight, and that's another difficulty. And also, there's a special training. So you're either a natural sciences researcher, you either do neurobiology, or you're a philosopher, a phenomenological philosopher. Being both is very hard. The way I think Varela was both, but that's very unusual. So the way I usually work is that I collaborate with people that this is their discipline. And a bunch of us together from both disciplines, 4 years ago, we published The Hitchhiker's Guide to Neurophenomenology that is trying to provide a typology of ways, how can we bridge these two irreducible domains, experience and physiology? So maybe let me walk you very briefly through these different bridges. From the simplest at the bottom to the most sophisticated on the top. First person validates the third person data. Of course, if I ask the people, did you experience a negative emotion? It validates the fact that I think I recorded negative emotion with these photos. The second one is front-loading the first person insight into the third person study design. And this is something, I don't know who am I talking to. Are you researchers of contemplative practices? But if you are, you definitely do that. You front-load your insight. I know I did because I had a very unique experience 20 years ago. And in that very unique experience, there was no sense of time or space or body or thought or emotion, definitely no sense of self. maybe it was just half an hour, but that half an hour really inspired my career. And it's my example of front-loading my insight into my study. We can also do a joint analysis. So, like I told you, create categories. Those who had, I don't know, let's say I'm looking into a self-dissolution. Those who had no self-dissolution, those who had full self-dissolution, and those in the middle. So I can have these three groups and then compare their neural data. That would be the third arrow. Now look at the fourth one, using the third person data to guide the first person. This is a little more tricky. How would I do that? I would love to ask you and get some answers from you, but I'll just continue with giving you my answers. So in this case, let's say I have a very interesting result. So for example, I'm looking into self-dissolution, and I see that what comes up is a reduction in activity in the temporoparietal junction, which is somewhere here and is responsible for multisensory integration. And so because I see that, I'm thinking, oh, I should ask them in the interview about their multisensory integration. So this is a way of using the neural data to guide the interview. Or at number 5, I could reanalyze the interview according to the first person enriched neural analysis. So in this case, if I have a very rich interview, after looking at the neural result, we would go back and look at the interview again, now thinking, oh, we might have left out a category that is interesting. We didn't focus on attention, for example. And then it became to be a core player. These are real examples of our studies. The final one, which is maybe the most difficult one, is the mathematical modeling, which I think is still in the level of trying to lay out a way to have a language about it. How can we talk about phenomenology in a way that is more formal within the predictive processing framework? It's not yet put to work, but it's a great step. Okay, so I arrived to the second stage. This was my introduction about what is neurophenomenology. Now I want to show you how my lab employs neurophenomenology, and we focus on self-boundary dissolution or on self-dissolution, let's say. Boundary is a word that came in a little later from a philosopher I worked with, Yochai Ataria. So we need to start with the self for some background, and then I'll show you, like I said, a series of 3 studies, from the proof of concept to zoom in to large scale. So how can we conceptualize self? Self is a very complex pattern. So for example, if we look at the work of, it's in the field of theory of mind. Let's think of the work of Sean Gallagher. When he speaks about the self, he came up with a theory that is called the self pattern theory. And that has something like all the way between 10 and 13 different aspects of the self. That is too complicated. We don't have that these nuances in neuroscience. So what I do here is I want to stick to a very gross conceptualization of the self that sees the self as a dual phenomenon. I have to say that I strongly disagree, because I don't think it's a dual phenomenon. I think it's a triad. I think that what we have is these two with the no self or self-transcendent as a third. And this is where I'm at. I just need an enthusiastic philosopher to write what I want to say. But anyways, until this happens, let's look at the two, these two, the dual nature. And it's a strong conceptualization because
Can I ask a quick question on that very rich point you just pointed towards? When you say that there's this possibly more of a tripartite model that you feel is probably more comprehensively accurate, one way that I could conceptualize what you're pointing towards is, okay, there's the I versus the me versus something like the non-dual self. Is that kind of what you're pointing towards? The experiential self that is experiencing itself as not dual, and therefore not just an I experiencing or a me, but with the narrative, but this kind of non-boundaried, there is no outside of itself kind of self.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
And I think that the studies that I'm about to show are really trying to look at the neural basis and phenomenology of this third possibility. And they want to show that this third possibility is available not only to very unique meditators in some caves, or even meditators at all. In the future project, what we want to do is to have novices with some neurofeedback trying to enter this state fast, I think. But anyway, for those who don't know, what Rael just mentioned is the what William James famously differentiated between the I and the me. The I is the experiencer, and the me is more a conceptual. Damasio would call it the core self and the autobiographical self. Dan Zahavi would call it pre-reflective or reflective self. Sean Gallagher would call it minimal self versus the narrative. I'll stay with the minimal and the narrative. So the minimal would be embodied, present moment experience. Think about a baby. A baby is very embodied. He's all about his body. He's all about the present moment. He has no past and future. He has no language. He has agency, or at least he starts to play with the possibility of agency. I can move my finger. Think of a simple animal. He's also experiencing ownership. If he has pain, he would cry because he's the owner of this pain. He also has a first-person perspective. He's seeing the world from usually somewhere in between the eyes. So the cognition is very perceptual. It's very embodied cognition. It doesn't need any memory or language or anything sophisticated. So in terms of ontogeny and phylogeny, that would be earlier than the second one. The second one, the me, the autobiographic, the reflective, the narrative, has a personal identity and self-evaluation. He has memory and future planning. He has a conceptual representation of oneself. He needs high-level cognitive function, such as language. This is why it's called the narrative self. It weaves stories about oneself. So I know that I am this and that. I know I'm a mother. I know I'm a wife. I know I'm a researcher. People told me that. I know what people think of me, and so forth. It's a concept. It's a conceptual representation of myself instead of experiencing myself from the inside. So why is this dual nature of the self so great? It's so great because since 2001, neuroscientists started tapping into neural networks that actually support the narrative self and the minimal self. This is really a long story, but I'm going to make it very short. The narrative self, here's a review paper from Nordhoff, Trends in Cognitive Sciences, 2004, top-level journal, saying that the possible underlying mechanisms for the narrative self is a very famous network called the default network, especially the midline structures of the default network. I'll keep it very simple. So we have a neural correlate that is related to the narrative self, and it mostly was studied with fMRI. Now, this took a little more time to look at the underlying mechanisms for the minimal self, but this is a paper by Olaf Blanke, again in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, 2019, giving the network for the minimal self. So look at the pink network with the self-location, because that would be a key player in my story. So here we have the temporal parietal junction that we said is related to multisensory integration, and the posterior cingulate cortex. Both of them are considered to be the underlying mechanism of the self-location. I know where my body is located in space because there's identification with one's own body and self. This is the PCC, and in the TPJ, there is multisensory integration. So because I receive visual, kinesthetic, I forgot how the ears are, how is it called, and proprioceptive information.
Auditory.
How do you call it?
Auditory.
No, not the one with the little
Oh, the cochlear.
The vestibular
Vestibular
sense.
cochlear, yeah, vestibular for the position and cochlear for sound.
Right. So by integrating all these signals, one knows one's position in space. If we are in, I don't know, free diving or anything that hampers one of these, if I'm sitting with my eyes closed and without movement, for example, like I do in meditation, that would actually pull the rug under the multisensory integration, because for a short moment, if I'm really still, I don't get these signals, and I can't totally understand where I'm located in space. So some people, when they even start meditate, they say that they feel like they are rotating or maybe a little bit tilted, or feel as if their body is bigger or smaller. Weird things start to happen. Anyways, this is the basis of the embodied self. The minimal self is also called embodied self. Okay, so up until now, I gave a short introduction saying, okay, we know about the self, that we can have at least two types of self, and we have their neural, some of its neural underpinning. And with this, I think we have enough to look at this, what I call is an evolving neurophenomenological dialogue. So that looks very dry and hard to follow. And I can't, really go and explain all that. It's mostly like to show that starting in 2009 and mostly in dialogue with the philosopher Yochai Ataria, whom when I met him, he was studying the Israeli pilots that were in the Egyptian prison. And he gave a lecture about how, because they were kept in prison and they had a very severe bodily damage, some of them lost the sense of body, and with it, they lost the sense of time and space altogether. And that also shifted the way they experienced their sense of self. So this connection he did between the body, time, space, and self was very much aligned with the way I saw meditation, but like an upside down, distorted mirror, because that he was looking at a very pathological situation, and I was looking at, I thought, and I still think, like optimal well-being. And so when we started working together, he also interviewed the meditators and started comparing between trauma and meditation. And actually this brought him to thinking about the boundaries, the self-boundaries as a major term to use, because in trauma, the boundaries are rigid. There are either no boundaries or very high and rigid boundaries. And with the meditators, he saw a very different example of flexible boundaries and volitionally shifting boundaries of the self. So I just wanted here to show you that I'm not going to start from the beginning, but the first project I want to show you with the 16 meditators is what I call study 1, is the proof of concept. And then I want to look at the case study with one very proficient meditator. And this is what I call zooming in study 2. And finally, I look at the large-scale study that I would call study 3. So, study 1, MEG. Let me say a word about MEG. How am I doing with the time?
You're doing great. You've been talking for about 40 minutes. So
okay.
20
So
minutes or so would be great. Or, if you need to take a little longer, you do.
Okay. Let me try to speed up here. MEG. MEG is similar to EEG because it records, well, it doesn't record electrical, but magnetic waves, or yes, I don't know how to say it, energy from the brain. And what's special about it is that it doesn't have the caveat of EEG that it's with EEG, it's hard to say where did the signal come from. So it's hard to have a source localizing that is reliable because of the distortion of the signal with the face and the head. And the MEG, because it's a magnetic signal, doesn't have this problem, so we can have a great source localization, especially if we have MRI of the same participants, which we did for this study. So we had 16 very proficient meditators here, and I had a very little grant, a Varela Award, a $15,000 that I just paid to a great guy called Yair Dor Zeiderman, who became best friend, and we keep working since then. And so we asked these people, we thought, okay, let's play. We asked these people, did you ever experience self-dissolution, no self? And these people said, yeah, it happens in retreats. So we said, okay, look, we want you to make for us narrative self. How would you do that? Try to think what characterizes you. Do it 3 times. And then give me a minimal self. How would you do that? Try to experience what is happening to you at the present moment. And then try to give me a selfless state. How would you do that? Try to experience what is happening in the present moment when you are not in the center. This is what we ask them. And we also ask them, how stable was it? Could they do it? And they said, yes, success, stability, pretty much the same between the 3 states. Self-report, yes, they could do it. Okay, looking at the brain. We are contrasting narrative self and minimal self. So the reduction from narrative to minimal is revealed in A and B. What we see is a reduction in pretty much medial prefrontal cortex in the gamma frequency, which is aligned with the literature about the default network. So as a sanity check, we said, fine, okay, default network activity reduces as one shifts from narrative to embodied. But look at C and D. C and D shows me what happens when one shifts from the minimal to the no self. And what we saw here is the bilateral inferior parietal lobule, which is very close to the temporoparietal junction. And that was in the beta frequency. Now, phenomenal categories. This is not a great example of doing phenomenology, but this is what we did. So we ended up having 3 different groups. This is only asking them about the selfless state. Let's focus on this group that we called at the time lack of ownership. Today, we would call them the full dissolvers, or I don't know, something like that. And look at SF, which is Stephen Folder. He said, it was emptiness, as if the self fell out of the picture. There was an experience, but it had no address. It was not attached to a center or subject. It was not 100%, but there was no sense of an object there running the show. Emptiness is the best word. So we took these 4 participants. We had 12 different judges. We came to agreement that this group went further into the dissolution experience. So here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but these 4 are also the most experienced meditators. And when I contrast between them and the other 8, what we see is again a significant reduction in the inferior parietal, specifically the right one in this case. And if you look in the literature, the right inferior parietal, but also the left, is about self-location, agency, and distinguishing the self from the other.
Can I ask a question on that point?
Please.
Is there a difference location-wise between, formerly the temporal-parietal junction and the IPL for those kinds of function, structure-function correlates that you're describing? Or would you say that the literature would suggest that either for the right TPJ or for the right IPL, all 3 of those, that's like hard to say that it's really one or the other because the literature is a little bit indistinct?
Right. I think that it's the same. I think it's the same because as we continue, we get a similar result and then we call it TPJ.
Right. And the interesting thing, I don't want to get too far into this line of questioning, but just if there's anything you can say reconciling the fact that oftentimes the default mode network actually does include the IPL or even TPJ in its canonical kind of structures. Of course, you know, the medial structures are most oftenly included, but the analysis of resting state data oftentimes picks up the right IPL or the bilateral IPLs in synchronous communication with the medial prefrontal and posterior cingulate cortices in a way that oftentimes the figure that you'll see projected on a screen from meta-analysis of a default mode network does include this structure.
Right, you're right. And specifically the posterior cingulate, definitely. So if we go back to this, although we can't see it here, but in the same paper, what we see is actually there are some overlaps, but they are in different frequencies. So when narrative reduces to minimal, it's in the gamma, and when minimal reduces to no self, it's in the beta, even if they are in overlapping regions. And I think that MEG does a better storytelling than the fMRI in this specific subject. I have no idea, though, why would one talk in the gamma and the other in the beta. And I know that there is literature about gamma and beta in the predictive processing, which one is the prediction and which one is the... But I can't tell you that I figured it out.
I'm in the same boat with you on that one.
And yeah, as I continue, you'll see my problem gets even worse because it becomes very specific. We have a very robust story about 27 hertz. And I don't even know why. Why is that? What's the 27 hertz thing? Okay, so this brought us to study number 2. In this point, we just realized that Stephen Folder is a unique participant. It so happens that he's also 75 and he's the elder and founder of the Insight Society in Israel. He has a PhD in biochemistry, so he understands science and he's happy to collaborate. So we went to his house. He's a farmer these days. And we asked him, can you know, we want to have this little boutique experiment with you. What can you do back and forth in the MEG that we can interview you and then have it very robust in terms of statistics? And he said, I can dissolve my self-boundaries. And says, okay, how many levels can you do that? And I don't even remember if he said 7 or 9, but it was a lot. And we told him, you know what, give us just 3. Give us just the normal boundaries, the total no boundaries, and something in the middle. And can you do that back and forth again and again? And he said, yes, yes, yes. And he did that. And so in this paper that is in consciousness and cognition, we only focused on the phenomenology. Let me see if this works. I have a video here. Can you hear that?
To go out of the boundary is another level of relaxation.
We can hear.
A deeper level of letting go, of surrender, of a sense that there's no need for center. And as if I'm falling out of the center. That's the best language I can give. I'm falling out of the center of even of sensations. There's no sensations. It's like falling into space.
So these are the dimensions that came out from the interview. And the resolution is very high, internal versus external, sense of center. I'm not going to go over all that, but most of them go down all the way to 0. What we are left with is something that Yochai called bodily feeling and the touched structure. Don't ask me what it is. This is Merleau-Ponty. I can tell you more about the brain. So what we saw in his brain is that everything reduced from SB1 to 2 to 3. We expected that while he reduces the sense of self or the self boundaries, some effort would build up, some attention would build up, something would enhance, but everything just seemed to be reducing. And the focus, the most significant difference was in the 27 hertz. And that was localized. You can see here it was localized, but the localization is so smeared that I cannot say if it's IPL or a TPJ. No, it's a big smear. And this is the posterior cingulate. Anyways, we took these two regions, these ROIs, and these frequencies. We went back to the previous 16 meditators, and sure enough, they also had the same. Now that we know what we were looking for, they also had the same frequency in the same location. Okay, that's, now we could aim and also receive some nice grant. And what we did now is
Can I ask one question on that point before you go on?
Yeah.
I would predict, having looked at a lot of EEG of meditators over the years, that that 27 hertz peak reduction from Stephen Fulder wouldn't be exactly 27 hertz in all the other meditators, that for some it might be 25, others it might be 29 or 26 or 23. Did you see that kind of pattern? Did you look at the you know, individual by individual data so that you could check and see where really was the peak beta reduction on a subject by subject level in this kind of inferior parietal, temporal parietal junction area?
I cannot tell you about going back to the data of these 16, what happened one by one, but I can show you what happened with the next 50.
Okay.
46, not 50, 46. These people have a very heterogenic, I would say, expertise between 1 and 30 years. And the mean would be around 4,000. They had 3 weeks of training with Stephen to familiarize with this boundary dissolution thing, because usually when we do Vipassana, this is not what we focus on. And then they did, of course, a bunch of questionnaires. Then they came to the lab and they did a sense of boundary, the SB state alteration task. So, and then we did a bunch of other tasks trying to look at embodiment and agency. But I'm not going to show all that. I want to focus about the sense of boundary alteration.
Who funded this study?
Who founded? So there was the BILE, the FQX Foundation. You know who they are?
I know BL, but I don't know FQX.
FQX is the Foundational Questions Institute or something like that. And there was the ISF, the Israel Scientific Foundation. Yeah. And I would say that even the tail of this project enters into a new funding by the Tiny Blue Dot. But this was already done. And then 1 year later, because of COVID, they came 1 year later, and then we could see if that was, if this kind of state becomes a trait, if it's a stable fingerprint. And then we also had a control group for them of 50 people. We actually also had another ayahuasca veterans, 50 people, to match, so we could have, we could compare beyond the induction mode of the self-dissolution, not as a state, but as a trait. But this is beyond here. Anyways, this is the phenomenology. This is, again, this student comes from philosophical background, and he looked into the interviews of the, this time, what we had is we asked them to maintain the boundaries and dissolve, and maintain and dissolve. We thought at the beginning we would see enhancing something and reducing something, and enhancing and reducing compared to the baseline. This is what we thought we would have. Anyways, he comes up with this phenomenological categories: agency, location, first-person perspective, attentional disposition, body sensations, affective valence. How can we naturalize these? This is the way we did it. Look at my mouse. So we had different judges. We looked at inter-judge agreement. We gave it numbers. So, for example, if we look at sense of agency, 1 would get very active, 3 would be passive, and 2 would be something in the intermediate. And I don't know, for the affective valence, we would have highly negative, slightly negative, mixed, neutral, and positive. So we could somehow translate it to numbers. So we could put them in this 3D space. We realized that first person, agency, and location are the major qualities or phenomenal qualities that drive the others. And we also saw that the full dissolvers were those who received the highest score for location, agency, and first person perspective. And they are here marked in red versus the other that are blue. This is the task. They were supposed to enhance, reduce, enhance, reduce, enhance, reduce. And they gave their own rating for quality and stability. Again, it seemed like, yeah, they can do it. Okay, jumping to the brain and to your question, take a look at that. When we look at the dissolution versus the baseline, it's on the 27 hertz. And when we look at the dissolution versus maintenance of boundaries, it's again 27 hertz. And when we look, where can we localize it? It's again, it's very smeared. But when we use the phenomenology to contrast the full dissolvers, which are those, with the others, which are those, you can see that there is a significant difference. The full dissolvers have a further reduction in beta 27 hertz over the PCC. So we know from the work of Judson Brewer and colleagues that the PCC is about attaching to one's own experience, one's own self. So I don't know. This is not one of the phenomenal categories that that came up for us. What came up for us are that those who were the full dissolvers, those who really gave up on trying to hold to their boundaries, were those who had the strongest reduction in beta over PCC. What else can I show you? I'm getting to the end here. I just want to show some things that this project also enabled us to take a step towards the what for, because before that it was very basic science, and even now it's still very basic science, but we at least gave them some social processing tasks, and one of them is how is it called? The emotion recognition task. So they have happy faces and negative faces, and their ability to identify the negative faces was smaller the higher the flexibility of the boundaries was. And the way we interpreted that was that, in a way, and against a survival-centered cognition, against the evolutionary tendency to identify negative faces as they are a threat. So the more flexible the boundaries, the less threat-centered cognition there would be. To the point.
What about the recognition of positive emotion? Was that not correlated with flexibility of boundaries? Okay.
No.
Got it.
Yeah. Another thing that I skipped here was that we didn't see the maintenance of boundaries. It was in between. So resting state, then maintenance, then no boundaries. And here again. So it wasn't, okay, going up from baseline, going down from baseline. And it took me a while to understand what was going on. What was going on, that it was that maintaining the boundaries, the strategy that they usually used for that was kind of body scan, because they wanted to sense the bodily boundaries. And a body scan is already a meditation. And
I would think that a better way to maintain boundaries in that conventional narrative self sense would be to attend to your narrative as much as possible.
Yes, that would reduce not the body boundaries, but the self boundaries.
Right.
Yeah.
Or keep them intact, I guess. If you're really attending, like, you know, engaging with the narrative.
Right.
So interesting that, you know, what you're describing, it makes a lot of sense to me too, is that the spontaneous strategy they adopted to maintain boundary happened to be the body boundary, which of course does actually involve some degree of relaxing the narrative kind of identification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's an example of how we employ the third person data to understand something about the first person data. Okay, and finally, I don't know if I have time for this, but it's just so beautiful. This is the baby of Yair. Yair Dor Zeiderman came up with Antoine Lutz with this death denial task. He showed in 2019, look at that, with non-meditators, just regular population, you know, the self-bias phenomenon. So if there's something about me, I would process it big time. So people were given their own face, stranger face, and a 50% morph in between them. And above that, they would have either a pain word or a death word like grave or corpse or whatever. And look at that. This is the death other, neutral other. Okay? So no difference. the neutral self gets more processing than the neutral other. That is because of the self-bias. But look at the death of the self. Death of the self should have been high up. Instead, it receives no processing.
Wow.
And this phenomenon is what they call the death denial. We don't want to deal with that. This is my face with the word death. I'm not processing. I didn't see that. And then looking at the meditators, look at that. The deaf self received exactly the highest processing as we would assume. And that correlated with the phenomenological affect. So the more relaxed, the more positive affect they experienced when dissolving the boundaries, it's like they are more in peace with the experiential dying. And so they do less of a death denial.
And
Yeah.
what kind of affect question is this data extracted?
Here it is. Highly negative, slightly negative, mixed, neutral, positive.
Got it. Got it.
There were a lot of words, but this is what we asked the judges to put them in the categories. So this is it. I finished. Just to say that the neurophenomenology is very challenging, but can be very rewarding. I hope I was able to, show you some of my enthusiasm about it. And also, I think that the tight relationship that we have between phenomenology and the neural data, like Varela suggested, to be a remedy to the heart problem, it's really, I think it's a paradigm shift away from a very strict materialistic view of consciousness. That's another thing I want to say, except the third selfless mode. Again, I would need philosophers to agree and be able to say that. Yeah, that's the beautiful theme. And